Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Britt once believed she had crossed the final threshold between life and death on that fateful night, the night she lunged into danger to save Jocelyn from the hook and collapsed from poison in her mother's arms. For the people of Port Charles, it was a tragic farewell, the final act in a life haunted by the slow, cruel progression of Huntington's disease and a trail of painful choices. But the death that everyone mourned had been a meticulously crafted illusion, orchestrated not by chance or mercy, but by an unseen force with sinister intent, Professor Henry Dalton. Far from being a benevolent man of science, Dalton was a calculating visionary obsessed with domination, of biology, of consciousness, of will itself. He believed humanity could be redesigned, its essence rewritten through pharmaceutical control and neurological manipulation. Britt had not been rescued. She had been claimed. To Dalton, she was the perfect vessel for a new age of experimentation, an unknowing subject in a covert operation codenamed Project Orion, a disturbing initiative to create fully obedient human prototypes by dismantling free will at the molecular level. The so-called medicine she injected into her own veins, believing it was delaying the ravages of Huntington's, was actually a sophisticated neurotoxin engineered to erode cognition, manipulate memories, and induce chemical dependency masked as therapeutic salvation. When Britt awoke in a cold concrete facility deep in the Croatian mountains, the outside world had long assumed her dead. No sunlight reached the sterile walls. Every inch of the room was monitored by infrared sensors and biometric scanners. She was not in a hospital, but a prison built from scientific ambition. She was told she was safe, that her condition was improving, and that she was free to live as long as she followed her treatment. Every day, Dalton visited her with the serene face of a savior, speaking of breakthroughs, of miracle thresholds crossed, of being the first human to truly defy the fate written into DNA. And in that brutal isolation, Britt began to believe. Her body responded. The tremors ceased. Her voice no longer faltered. Hope flickered where there had once been despair. Yet, as her physical health seemingly stabilized, a deeper dread began to rise. On the days she missed a dose, the world became a hellscape. Her body writhed in agony, her mind slipped into confusion, and memories, once solid, fractured into incomprehensible images. She dreamed of people who never existed, remembered moments that had never occurred. Her hands scribbled names she didn't recognize. Jason, Liesel, Jocelyn, all became hazy, like words written in steam. It was then that she understood. Something inside her was being systematically erased. Bit by bit, the woman she had been was disappearing, replaced with a programmable shell sculpted by Dalton's poison. Back in Port Charles, Sonny Corinthos was tracing an entirely different trail. What began as a curiosity, a series of unusual financial transfers for medical equipment, became an obsession when he uncovered a web of hidden dealings connected to a Balkan facility. Sonny had long lived in shadows, and he recognized the scent of a cover-up. A name buried within the document set alarm bells ringing: Dalton. A man long rumored to operate outside ethical bounds, now silently bankrolled by Brennan and Sidwell under a medical philanthropy front. Delving deeper, Sonny acquired access to encrypted files smuggled from a European lab, including schematics and research folders under the label Project Orion. One document made his blood run cold. Britt's name, listed under the codename Subject Alpha. She hadn't died. She had been abducted, repurposed, and drugged into compliance as part of a biotechnological nightmare. Furious and determined, Sonny activated a forgotten network of Jason's former allies, ex-intelligence contacts, mercenaries, and medical moles, assembling a silent task force to infiltrate the Croatian site and recover her at any cost. Unbeknownst to Dalton, Britt had begun her own resistance. Using a diagnostic override code she remembered from her years as a physician, she breached the lab's intranet late one night and accessed the drug synthesis files. The truth was worse than she imagined. The compound she injected daily wasn't treating Huntington's, it was redesigning her. The substance was an artificial neuroagent that embedded itself into the central nervous system, subtly rerouting neural pathways to produce desired emotional and cognitive states. After 3 months of treatment, the average subject lost the ability to distinguish hallucination from reality. They became programmable, suggestible, ideal for long-term behavioral repurposing, spies, political pawns, medical assassins. Britt read line after line of data detailing her deterioration as if she were a line item in an experiment, her memories mapped, her reactions measured. She was no longer a patient. She was a test case. The shock shattered what little trust she had left. She wasn't just being held. She was being annihilated from the inside out. As she prepared to flee, half crazed, half hopeful, Dalton discovered her breach and initiated a purge protocol. All subjects and assets were to be destroyed within 48 hours. The facility descended into chaos. Guards were placed on high alert. Britt was locked in her room. But then, in a stroke of fate that felt both divine and impossible, Sonny arrived. Dressed in tactical gear and flanked by 2 former WSB operatives, he fought his way through security corridors under the cover of night, locating Britt just moments before she would have been sedated for termination. When Britt saw him, disoriented, terrified, barely able to speak, something inside her broke and healed all at once. In that moment, she wasn't Subject Alpha. She was Britt. And she was safe. Sonny carried her through gunfire, explosions, and smoke, shielding her body with his own until they reached a hidden extraction point and fled to a safe house nestled in the Swiss countryside. There, Liesel waited, tears spilling down her face as she embraced the daughter she thought she'd lost twice. But Britt was no longer the same. The drugs had left scars, neurological voids that couldn't be patched by love alone. Some mornings she awoke in terror, not recognizing her own face in the mirror. Some nights she whispered names into the dark, unsure if they were friends or figments. Her hippocampus had suffered chemical degradation, her long-term memory was fractured. She oscillated between lucidity and blankness, caught in a limbo where reality flickered like a broken film reel. Sonny, however, never left her side. Despite once having limited interaction with Britt, something about her strength, her refusal to surrender to despair, stirred in him a resolve deeper than any obligation. He became her anchor, reading aloud old case files, showing her pictures from her past, guiding her back toward herself one moment at a time. As weeks passed, fragments began returning. A smell. A phrase. A color that triggered an emotion. Britt learned to walk again without trembling, to smile again without fear. But she also vowed to fight. The project hadn't died with the destruction of the facility. Dalton had backups. Sidwell and Brennan still moved in silence, reshaping the future of biological warfare. Britt held knowledge no one else had, knowledge that could expose a global conspiracy rooted in medicine, memory, and mind control. With Sonny's help, she began recording testimonies, decrypting files, and preparing to testify against those who had reduced her to an experiment. But more than that, she began to reclaim her life. Not the life she had before the hook, or before Dalton, but a new one. One shaped by trauma, yes, but also by defiance. And in the silence of the Swiss dusk, when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the world held its breath, Britt would sometimes take Sonny's hand and whisper, "I'm still here." And he would nod, not as a mob boss, or a rescuer, but as a man who had witnessed a resurrection. She was not a victim. She was not a subject. She was the beginning of the end for those who believed science could overwrite the soul. Britt Westbourne had died. And yet, she lived. When Dalton discovered that Britt had breached the core of his encrypted data network, his composed demeanor shattered. Panic, cloaked in icy precision, swept across his features as he issued the most extreme directive in his arsenal, immediate liquidation of Subject Alpha. The command was clear: Britt had become a liability, a ticking bomb that, if left uncontained, would unravel years of covert experimentation and expose Project Orion to global scrutiny. Alarms shrieked throughout the facility, drowning out any trace of humanity that once masqueraded beneath the sterile halls. Red lights strobed violently across reinforced corridors, doors locked into emergency lockdown mode, and containment units began initiating the auto-purge sequence. Britt, still weak and dazed from withdrawal, was seized and sedated, her body strapped to a cold steel gurney in the isolated wing. The countdown had begun, not in minutes, but in procedures. A slow, mechanical dismantling of her existence as if she were merely faulty equipment slated for disposal. But fate, once again, refused to surrender her. Just as the anesthetic began seeping into her bloodstream, gunfire erupted near the outer compound. Chaos unfolded like a second wave of alarm, not programmed but raw and human. Sonny and his strike team had arrived, not as shadowy mercenaries but as a desperate last hope cutting through walls of protocol and deception. Equipped with encrypted schematics stolen from Dalton's server, they knew where Britt was held. Every step was calculated, every bullet fired with surgical intent. Dalton's guards, elite but unprepared for the kind of resolve born of guilt and fury, fell one by one. Through clouds of smoke, amidst the sirens and shouts, Sonny reached Britt, motionless, eyes fluttering, face pale against the clinical white of the gurney. He ripped the four from her arm, lifted her trembling form into his own, and whispered promises that she couldn't yet understand. In that moment, Britt collapsed, not from exhaustion but from the soul-crushing weight of nearly being erased again. She clung to him, tears mixing with the dirt and chemical sweat on her face, knowing that what had just been taken from her wasn't just her life, but fragments of her mind that may never return. Sonny transported her through a private aerial corridor to a hidden medical retreat in the Swiss Alps, operated discreetly by Liesel, who had long since abandoned her public affiliations in favor of underground neurological research. The compound was a haven for those failed or forgotten by conventional medicine, and now, Britt became its most urgent case. Liesel was shattered to see her daughter in such a state, alive, but fragmented. Specialists in cognitive reconstruction, memory retrieval, and trauma stabilization worked around the clock, deploying state-of-the-art protocols to halt the degenerative effects of the compound Dalton had injected into her. Scans revealed inflammation and scarring across Britt's hippocampus, the region responsible for long-term memory. Her brain had been chemically rewritten, and while the neurotoxin had ceased its spread, the damage was irreversible in certain quadrants. Each day in recovery was a fragile experiment in hope and despair. Some mornings, Britt awoke lucid, even optimistic. She asked about Port Charles, about the hospital, about her mother's work. She remembered Liesel's lullabies, the smell of the snow in Switzerland, and the way Jason's eyes looked when he tried not to smile. But then came the dark hours. There were days she didn't recognize Sonny at all. She'd recoil from his presence, mistaking him for a captor or a memory fragment from Dalton's simulations. There were nights she stood silently before the fogged bathroom mirror, tracing the name, Jason, into the condensation over and over again, unaware why her heart clenched every time she finished the last letter. Liesel would sometimes stand at the door, watching her daughter wander through memoryless corridors like a ghost haunting her own body, and silently weep for the woman who once defied death but now teetered on the edge of erasure. And Sonny, who had never been intimately close to Britt before, became something entirely unexpected, her compass, her continuity, her historian. He was the keeper of her memories, recounting them not as a way to restore her but to remind her she had once lived a full life. He read aloud old medical reports she had authored, showed her pictures from her time at General Hospital, and described in vivid detail the night she saved Jocelyn, the moment she chose sacrifice over survival. At times, she stared at him with blank, fearful eyes. But slowly, imperceptibly, there were flickers of familiarity. A touch that didn't make her flinch. A smile she returned before realizing she had done so. Sonny saw it not as progress but as resurrection, slow, painful, but undeniable. What began as obligation hardened into loyalty, and that loyalty evolved into something deeper, something neither of them dared name aloud. In the quiet hours of the alpine nights, Sonny often found himself studying her as she slept, her breathing shallow but steady, and wondered if she dreamed of anything anymore. Or if the dreams, too, had been stripped from her. And when she awoke in a panic, unsure who she was or where she had been, it was always his voice that calmed her, anchoring her to the present. Sometimes, her fingers would find his hand and squeeze it ever so gently, not out of understanding, but out of instinct. Something inside her recognized that he had saved her, and not just once. He had stood between her and oblivion, not with medicine or weapons, but with unwavering presence. The line between caregiver and companion blurred slowly, gently. Sonny didn't push, he didn't expect. He simply remained. And in those rare, crystalline moments of clarity when Britt looked at him with the softest expression, not of fear, but of quiet gratitude, he realized he had become more than a rescuer. He had become her mirror, reflecting back the pieces of herself she thought forever lost. There were still miles of trauma to walk through. Still days when the shadows of Dalton's programming returned with chilling force. But Sonny now walked those miles with her, no longer out of guilt or duty, but because her survival had become inextricably tied to his own purpose. Britt's journey from victim to survivor was far from over. But for the first time, she was no longer walking it alone. She was not just recovering, she was reclaiming. Bit by bit, with each shared memory, with every morning she remembered Sonny's name, and every night she wrote, Jason, a little less, she was rebuilding not just her identity, but her will. And Sonny, holding the fragments of her pain like sacred relics, was beginning to see that what had started as a mission to expose a conspiracy had turned into the quiet forging of something unbreakable. In a world that tried to delete her, Britt Westbourne was learning to write herself back into existence. One heartbeat, one memory, one sunrise at a time. The relationship between Britt and Sonny didn't blossom from a moment of passion or a fleeting glance across a crowded room. It didn't explode with desire or flirtation like so many love stories born in the heat of urgency. Instead, it emerged slowly, deliberately, forged in the crucible of shared trauma, fear, and the long, suffocating silence that follows near death. In those quiet, often unbearable hours when Britt questioned her own identity, when her mind wandered through blank spaces where memories once lived, Sonny was there, solid, patient, and unwavering. He became the constant in a world where everything else, even time, felt unstable. Their bond was not built on lust, but on endurance, empathy, and the unspoken understanding between two souls who had seen too much and survived anyway. As Britt's cognitive clarity began to flicker more regularly like an old light bulb finding a steady current, fragments of her past returned, not always in order, not always with context, but with enough emotional weight to stir something deep inside her. The name, Dalton, surfaced first, spat out in a moment of panic during a therapy session when a nurse accidentally used the word, procedure. Then came the shadows. Half-formed memories of surgical lights, whispered commands, pain masked as progress. She remembered the cold smile Dalton wore when he promised her longevity, the way his hands hovered over her chart like a conductor over a symphony, composing not healing, but control. It wasn't long before she understood, she had been weaponized. Not just experimented on, but engineered into something others could manipulate. But Britt was not the girl she once was. She was no longer the brash, reckless surgeon trying to outrun her past. The trauma had sharpened her, burned away vanity, stripped her to her essence. And what remained was iron. Though her medical license was suspended, though her hands trembled when she tried to hold a scalpel, her mind remained razor-sharp, and within it lived the genetic formulas, research logs, and encrypted data protocols of Project Orion. She didn't just remember the pain, she remembered the science. And she realized that if Dalton's network was still active, if any fragments of the Orion protocol still existed, she was the only one alive with enough knowledge to decode and destroy them. Determined not to let what happened to her happen to anyone else, Britt asked Sonny to help her take the fight to the shadows. It wasn't a request born from revenge, though she had every right to seek it, but from an unshakable sense of duty. She knew the cost of inaction, and despite the permanent scars etched into her psyche, she refused to let them define her future. Sonny, who had once acted as her shield, now became her sword. He reactivated dormant contacts, reached out to former WSB agents, and reconstructed a web of intelligence that stretched across Europe and back to Port Charles. Together, they weren't just survivors. They were hunters, chasing ghosts through encrypted files, whispered transactions, and lab remnants buried beneath phony charities and dead shell companies. Their partnership deepened, shifting from survival to purpose. Sonny, who had seen the worst of human corruption, found in Britt not a victim, but a mirror of his own evolution, a person scarred by betrayal who nonetheless chose to stand up, again and again, with trembling but resolute hands. He protected her not out of pity, but out of reverence. She had been broken, reshaped, and reassembled with fragments of grief and fire, and yet she remained one of the bravest people he had ever met. He became her bodyguard, her confidant, and most critically, the living archive of her true self, the memories she could no longer retrieve, the woman she sometimes forgot she used to be. Britt, in turn, began to rely on Sonny in ways she had never relied on anyone before. She no longer needed him to keep her physically alive, she needed him to remind her why life was still worth living. In moments of regression, when the ghosts of Dalton's programming returned, when she couldn't tell dream from reality, she would sit motionless for hours, her fingers trembling, her lips murmuring incomplete thoughts. But in those moments, Sonny never looked away. He never flinched. His gaze remained steady, his voice low and grounding.